Prince Edward's Journey to Islam. Written by Julia Hanke. Read for you by Ayman Sabawi. Prologue. It is the year 1285, and the Blossom Island, which is comparable to medieval England, is reigned by two kings, King Henry Brighton and his brother, Blake Brighton, known as Blake Thornhard. It has been over 200 years since King Lexis Brighton, in actual history William the Conqueror, forced Norman rule over the fractious people of the Blossom Island. King Henry's rule is peaceful, but Thornhard and his allies are conspiring to change this. In the larger world, it is a time of trials and uncertainty. Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil wants to take the city of Fantasy Acre from the Christians while defending his kingdom against the Buddhists. It is a time for heroes and legends to rise. Practicing stick fight. 1285 in Goldmouth. The blow caught Edward on the side, on his cheek. He staggered, fell back a few steps until it relieved him to feel the solid trunk of an old English tree behind him. Moments later, he pulled himself together and went on the attack. His blows were precise: feint, attack, parry, high cut, quick retreat, and then a thrust forward, causing his opponent to stumble and almost fall backward. Edward was preparing a final blow when his opponent's stick struck him on his hand. Edward dropped his stick, held his hand over his mouth, and stepped back. Tears glistened in his eyes. "You deceived me, father," he said. "You just pretended as if you were falling." King Henry Brighton laughed, tossed his wooden weapon into the grass, and patted his son on the shoulder. "In a fight, nothing is ever fair," he said with a grin. "Remember that. It's only about who wins," said his father. "I thought we were honorable knights who don't cheat," he said. "You? A knight?" King Henry burst in laughter. "I am afraid before you become a knight, you will have to eat a few more roasted chickens. At present, what I see before me is a skinny 10-year-old child." Edward bit his lips. He hated it when father teased him like that. Among boys his age, he was usually the smallest, but the most talented at wielding the stick. None of his friends dared to call him a child for a long time. Edward's skill was well known. Whenever Henry had time, he practiced with Edward in the courtyard of Goldfort Castle, or in the close-by forest, just like today, his birthday. "I am 11 today," he said, disappointed to his father. "Did you forget?" King Henry Brighton raised his hand apologetically and smiled. "Forgive me. Very well then, noble knight Edward Brighton. May I invite you after this mock battle to my castle for an almond cake with custard?" Edward laughed as his father pulled a few comical faces. His anger had disappeared. Father and son had been walking in the forest since sunrise. First they had hunted deer with some of his father's servants, but then Henry led him to a lonely clearing where he showed him some more sword-fighting tricks. For many hours they had practiced attacks and defense. They would collide with each other repeatedly, and then spring back until sweat ran down Edward's cheeks and every muscle in his body hurt. It was an incredibly special day. His father rarely dedicated an entire day to him. Normally, Henry was busy with administrative duties in Goldfort Castle, which lay in the rather isolated parts of Goldmouth. Or he was far away fighting for Sultan Shamsuddin of the Levant against Genghis Darksword. As long as Edward could remember, wars had been raging in the Blossom Island as well as the Levant. It had all started long ago in the distant Void Shadow Empire, where the Buddhists revolted against the Muslim Sultan Shamsuddin and threw his representative from a window of Dragon Spire Castle. Afterward, the Buddhists had been killed in large numbers in the Battle of Atara, and ever since, war had spread like wildfire through the Levant. Edward's mother once told him that the war was every bit as old as he was himself, and sometimes it seemed to Edward that the conflict would never end, for as long as he lived. "You have made good progress in sword fighting," his father said, as they walked through the Goldmouth forest. It was early fall and the leaves on the old oaks shone in many colors. Especially fainting, but always your low cut is much improved. Now I can tell you I actually stumbled briefly. King Henry Brighton shook his head. But don't tell anyone. If word gets around that my 11-year-old outsmarted me, Sultan Shamsuddin won't take me on any more expeditions. That is good. Then you'll have to stay at home with us, Edward replied with a grin. With me, mother, and Amelie, and you could teach me more tricks. His father sighed. I'm afraid I cannot do that, my boy. Now that the Buddhists have attacked at Tora, I will probably have to fight again soon. Then take me along, Edward demanded excitedly. He straightened up so he would look bigger. You said yourself I'm an excellent swordsman. I could fight in the Blue Musketeers, just as you used to. I can start out as a simple servant and then— Enough of this talk, his father interrupted while frowning. War is no game. Be happy that you have been spared. You may be a good fighter with a stick, but war is something completely different. Actual blood is shed, and I don't want it to be yours. No more of that nonsense right now. King Henry fidgeted with his belt and held his breath. I fear you will have to fight soon enough to defend our kingdom against your Uncle Blake Thornheart, he said, and then he sighed exasperately. As they walked through the dense forest, listening to the singing of birds, Edward thought about all the tales he had overheard when grown-ups talked about war. Edward had long ago stopped trying to understand who the bad ones and the good ones were in the never-ending conflict. Buddhists fought against Muslims in the Levant, and the foreign powers such as the French, Spaniards, and recently the Mongols were in search of spoils of war in the Caronia Empire. King Henry was an English Christian king, but supported both Sultan ibn Qalawun of Caronia Empire and Sultan Shamsuddin of the Levant.